Hey, Composing Gloves here, and today we're going to be jumping into the master controls of Slicex and talking about what they control. Also layering samples, and that's pretty much it. So all these guys up here in this little black bar area, we went over practical controls and things you would do in the last video, so let's get a little more specific. So right off the bat, you may have a different display than me. So to change your display, you can click these little guys right here, and they will slowly reveal more. The last one controls the keyboard. So if you are like, where's this cool keyboard thing? And it's a keyboard in the style of the step editor. So that one that threw me for a loop when I opened it for the first time. I was like, what is this? This isn't like a sequencer. It looks like a keyboard, but you know, it was weird. I was like, what the junk? Okay, so another thing, let's come over here. We have auto dump. What it does is it'll take whatever's in deck A. So we have two decks, right? We have deck A and deck B, and you can switch between them, and we can load samples in each of them. As I was said before, I never use this feature, but I have an idea of how it works. And what it is auto dump will take whatever's in deck A and dump it to your keyboard. So it'll take all your slices and put it on your keyboard for you. Pretty handy. Now, keyboard input's an important one. So with it on, Slicex has a whole bunch of internal keyboard commands, and if you want it to recognize those keyboard commands while you're typing on your keyboard, you have to have keyboard input on. So if I hit S, it switches between the spectrum view and the waveform view, which maybe that's something I want to do, or more likely maybe I'd want to open up the blur tool on this thing. So I would hit Control B, and look at that, there's the blur tool and a whole bunch of other nifty shortcuts. They label them for you, so they're not that hard to learn, and you'll find yourself probably going to certain ones more than others. Like normalize, that's a pretty common one. So with this off though, this allows me to use my keyboard. Instead of triggering commands, I can trigger MIDI commands, so I can play back regions of my sample. And the way I would have to make sure that if I'm going to keep this off, I'm going to need to make sure that my typing keyboard is on, because if this is off, then nothing will happen, and that's lame. So here's what it sounds like. So you see, bam, we're good to go. So I'm going to turn that off, turn that back on, because I have a MIDI keyboard. So I can use my typing keyboard for typing things. Okay, cool. We're going to come back to layering here in a second, and let's come over here to these master knobs. These are probably the most straightforward. We have a volume control. So if I were to hit a note, you see it can scale the volume. If you want to reset something, middle mouse click, and you're good to go. We have a scale randomization and a scale LFO. These are references to controls inside the envelope or graph section. And what we have here is we have a random area. So we're able to take a parameter and give it a degree of randomness. And that degree of randomness can be very great or very small. We'll talk about this when we get into this area. And you're able to scale that on a master level. So we're able to turn down it for all randomization happening right here. So that's a pretty handy dandy tool. And then we have a master LFO. And what's funny is I actually do occasionally grab these, because sometimes you're working on a patch and it gets really complicated, and you come in and you just need a way to turn everything down, and this can be a great way to sort of put things in their place. So we have LFO, and this will of course allow us to, in this case, the LFO would be controlling the cutoff. We could have an LFO controlling the volume. LFO is covered in the Sound and Synth Basics series if you don't know what that is. And we're able to scale the maximum value, and we can even invert it. So those are some options you have there. And lastly, we have pitch. So we're able to take this and change the pitch. If you have a problem with your tuning, I really prefer words. I mean, you can hover over things and see what they say, but man, I just prefer words than this, because like these are the dice. Okay, the dice is kind of common. That sort of looks like an LFO. I can guess volume, but I don't see pitch when I see keyboard. I don't know. So next up we have modulation. This thing is exactly the same as what's in Citrus. What it is you could take any of these controls up here and you can link them to mod X and mod Y, which are these guys, mod X and Y. They're just knobs, and you can link parameters to them to be controlled. And if we look at like mod X, for example, if I move X, you can see that it's scrolling through X, and that allows us to link up meaningful controls, something that we would want to be able to automate to this. So let's say that I wanted to control my volume with mod X. Well, you see, mod X right now, no matter where I put X, it will be at its maximum value. I don't want that. I want it to be from its minimum to maximum value. So now if I play, Mod X is essentially a volume knob. But let's say, now you might be going, why would I want to do that? Well, maybe you have a particular part of your sample that is acting funny and you want to turn it down, but only by a certain amount. And you want a very unusual volume control that turns down and up and down in just this weird fashion. You're able to do that no problemo. And so we'll get into this a little bit later. We also have smoothing. So this is just true of anything, and it's the reason why you may choose to not automate a fader and automate a plugin instead. And that is, when you automate something or when you move something, it's got to get to from point A to point B. And the way it does that, it has a lot of options, right? It can go from, let's say that point A is up here and point B is over here. Well, let me make sure I'm in the shot. Point A, point B, and it's going to ramp up to it. But it could go like that instead. Like it could curve in different ways. And so what this does is it's smoothing off, is it just goes bam, bam, like it's right there, man. And if you turn this on, it'll smooth its way there. I think there's still a tiny bit of smoothing. Otherwise, you get like horrendous clicks. But yeah, so I normally leave it off. But if you're having problems with that, just turn smoothing on. The thing is, it takes a little more time to do the responses. So if you're writing really precise movements, smoothing may not be an option for you. So, okay, next up we have layering. So now we have the ability to put in 2 samples. So we have a sample right now in deck B, and this is over here, or deck A. It's a little confusing because when you click it, it just switches. But in deck A, we've got this here kick sample, and we could see the regions we have, and we could see up here, we can scroll through using this little master view. So, okay, now let's load up a sample into deck B. So to do that, you just grab a sample. Let's just grab this hi-hat and put it and see, there it is, deck B. If you want to switch between them, oh, deck A, deck B, deck A, deck B. And we're really, really great, handy dandy, right? So now what we're going to do is let's say that we want to layer some of these things together in an interesting way to create layered samples. Well, to do that, we come up here and we have a couple of options. The first one we see here is same deck. What does that mean? Well, it looks like it would keep I don't know. To me, I thought it would layer both of them the first time I saw it. I don't know what is making sense, but it makes sense the way they named it. Same deck will only allow you to layer samples within the same sample. And the way you layer 2 samples is you just assign them to the same MIDI key. So in order to reassign a region, we'll go ahead and click and we'll go to trigger notes and then your last hit note. So I hit a D5 last, so I'm going to make this, or assign that one. But anyways, as you see right now, it's been assigned to D5. And let's say I want to layer marker 11. So I'm going to go ahead and click over here and layer that to trigger note last hit. Now if I hit them, you see that they both go at the same time. If I try and come down here and let's say trigger note last hit, you see that you can't hear it. It's not working. You do not hear that sample. But if we turn off same deck, now you can hear it. Even though the region moved to the note I was playing because it's D5, so it'll move the region selection, that doesn't mean that it was triggering the sample because you couldn't hear it. So that's what same deck does. So pretty handy dandy that. We also have the ability to crossfade between our samples. So we can start in deck A and then slowly change the volume into deck B. That's where we get into this layering tab up here. We have a way to gain compensate layering. So when you play them together, obviously they're going to sound louder. So what this does, it will turn them down so that they sound the same as one layer. Well, it'll take, instead of it sounding like 2 layers and get louder, the 2 layers will merge, but they'll turn down the volume to compensate for getting louder. That's all that does. We have velocity mapped, X modulation mapping, Y modulation mapping. So velocity will switch between them according to how hard or soft we hit the key. We can do it randomly. We can cycle between them. We can do some song time syncing. A lot of these things I'm just not going to get into because I never use them. Random is pretty cool. If we select random, just randomly selects things. It's pretty great. And if we come over here, the ones that you probably would use the most are modulation X map and Y map. So we're going to use X. And now these crossfade settings become more active. And because if we move our X value, it will now use the curve we select here to crossfade between our samples. So we can do a linear crossfade. We could do one where it just one side is one sample, the other side is the other. So that's that one. that's that one. So you have all these options between going deck A and deck B. Again, I don't really use these all that much, but they're pretty cool. You have one over here. It's a little more like a tangent curve. So I actually kind of like that one the most. That's the one I like the most. But there are other curves. You can experiment, get something that you like if this is something you're going to do. Because I have reactor ensembles that, like S-layer and stuff, that I'd use for interesting layering of samples. And then I just write my samples in the playlist. So I don't often use this, but it's an option there. Let's go into this little triangle macro guy here. So we have macros. So we have 2 decks loaded, and we have all these regions, right? So we can assign the decks to the whole keyboard, which I believe is actually only the white keyboard. Because if we look here, we see that we have 1 sample, and we have a little break. So it puts a little break for us so we can see where the second sample begins. So it's already marked it for us. But what we can do is we can do assign both decks to black and white keys, and you see, bam, it'll map all the regions, and we can see all the notes they've been assigned to. How handy dandy is that? Where deck A is the white keys and deck B is the black keys. We also have the ability to layer both decks, and so now each corresponding region has been layered. So the first one here, C5, is equal to C5 over here. And do I have a weird setting? Oh, I have the layering modulation on. So let's just go to all. And you can hear it. There it is. So, okay. So that's what those do. I'll let you go ahead and mess with these. There's just a whole bunch of ways to do this. One that's pretty useful for just in general is we can assign deck A regions to Articulator 1 and deck B regions to Articulator 2. So by default, you're going to have them all set to Articulator 1. And you may want to treat deck B differently. And it's sort of a hassle to come through here and slice each thing so that individually goes into into the second articulator slot. So each one of these articulator slots represents a different state of all these controls over here. So if I make a volume control with my envelope like this to deck A, it'll also be applied to deck B. Again, I might not want that. So I can make them all go to Articulator B. So I can do something in Articulator 1 and then go to 2 and do a different thing, and no problem. It will automatically put everything there for me. So that's a really nice way of doing things. We also have normalized layer region levels, just normalization. And we also have some settings here. So sample start, cover whole length. So we have a offset start position here, and this start position will change where the sample starts in the first 100 milliseconds. You might be going, the first 100 milliseconds, why only the first 100 milliseconds? Well, that's because that's where the most sensitive information for how you perceive the sample is. If that's where the transient is, which it should be because it's the beginning of the sample, you are going to, if you move throughout that transient, you're going to drastically change the character of the sound. And so by changing the start offset, that's what you're changing, and it's usually within the first 100 milliseconds. After that, you might be changing offset over here in the middle of nowhere where there's like no sound at all. See over here, we'd be changing things. Over here, no change. So that's what this would do, though, is it would say, instead of doing the first 100 milliseconds, and you even see it says up here, if we look at our hints, it says sample start covers the whole length. So as we move it, our offset can go anywhere within the length of our region, which is pretty handy. We have link velocity to volume, which is velocity sensitivity. That's where that control is. Usually there's a button out there, but this time it's in a menu. This one is something that's pretty cool. So we have loop half of regions. And so what we have here is when we hit a note, it will then loop half the region. And there's clicking and stuff, but it's still cool. You might find a handy reason for that. So that's looping for you. And we also have a high quality envelopes setting. So you might be wondering what is this? Well, if we come in here, we have all these different envelopes, right? We're able to turn them on and off. These things have to be generated by what's called a controller signal. And it's very CPU inefficient to give everything audio resolution or higher. It's just not useful. You don't need that much information to create an envelope that can control things reasonably. So what they do is they use a lower resolution. In Reactor, you see this all the time. It's one of the basic ways you can, well, in Reactor 5, I think they did away with it in 6. You can optimize your CPU optimization. So basically, you can make them higher quality. I'm not sure how much more bang for the buck you'll get. If you're trying to do something really specific and really short amount of time, like a very specific click or something, then that could be an option for you. But honestly, I wouldn't worry about it very much. Then we also have an about tab, just tells you some stuff. That's just like the basic, oh, who made it and stuff like that. And then we also have a lock audio data. And what this does is it doesn't actually freeze the audio data down here. What it does is it will keep the audio data here between layering, changing the preset. So if I change my preset, you see it stays the same. And if I turn it off, it will go away. There goes Gonzo. Also, you can load something by clicking on this guy right here too, and it'll pull up a finder and you can find a sample and load it that way. But I always drag on just because it's way more intuitive. But anyways, that could be important. Maybe you have a particular setup you like is your sampler engine and you'd rather start there, but you forgot you loaded it in default. Well, you can just lock audio data and go ahead and migrate on over there. So that is the master controls. If you have any questions about these controls, let me know. Subscribe, support me on Patreon, and have a blessed day.